I don't know exactly if he is quite critical for the short-term incentives, but indeed, I believe that if a government gives incentives to companies, that will be probably that will be fit in the quite status quo approaches related to sustainability. I think on the long term, we really need system changes, kind of what we call socio-technical transitions. And then indeed, maybe we need something else. And then the question is, will a government who also is part of what we can call socio-technical regime as a dominant actor, they often also fit in the status quo approaches, believing in economic growth, technological innovations. And on the long term, we need, besides those technological innovations, probably also some other things that focus on sufficiency, for instance, and not only on eco-efficiency. So indeed, I think he's right that I think that's mostly focusing on the short-term interest of the whole debate on climate change.
Yeah, first of all, I would say to Jordan's comment that we live in an era that we sort of vilify making profits. So I first would like to say something in defense of making profits. Because in a way, that's the raison d'etre of firms, of course. We incur costs to make something, a product or service, and we probably, we sell it to generate revenues, and hopefully these revenues are bigger than the costs. And we sort of vilify firms for being focused on profit, but we know from research that creating profits and hence creating economic wealth can do an awful lot of good. Simply a lot of things like malnutrition or even stillbirths or crime levels or even general levels of happiness are related to economic wealth. So in a way, profit is not a bad purpose in and of itself. Now, of course, you don't want to pollute the planet and treat people badly, so we optimize under constraints, so to speak, but we don't need a different purpose. So profit in itself isn't necessarily bad. To Jordan's point, does that inherently make firms short-term oriented? I would say not inherently. In a way, profits often are about making profits in the longer term. We build a chemical plant now, we try to invent a drug now, so that maybe a decade from now or even more, we can generate revenues that are higher than these costs. Where Jordan is a little bit right, is that it actually is pretty human to prefer short-term profits over longer-term ones. Even if I would say, if I say to Joe or you, Joe, or to Jordan here, I want to give you 100 euros. Shall I give it to you tomorrow or next year? Oh, you're probably going to say, well, tomorrow, please. Even if I say next year 101 euros, you're probably still going to say, well, 100 euros tomorrow will be nice. I need to give you 120 in a year or something like that to be able to make that trade-off. So it's pretty human to prefer short-term profits and the certainty of those. Where Jordan is also right that we know also from research that certain circumstances can make companies a bit too short-term oriented. And that is, for example, because the stock market can see the certainty of profits now, but it's much more difficult to see, well, what happened 10 years from now. So they emphasize short-term profits. Also, individual top managers, well, if your company is making a lot of profit now, that's prestigious for you, you get better remuneration and so on, not what happens 10 years from now. So we also do know from research, so there is a point that we have to be careful to make sure that companies can focus on the long term. And we do things about this. We give them long-term incentive plans, for instance, to top managers, but that, I have to admit, that's work in progress. We haven't solved that problem yet. We'll probably never get there entirely, but it's we need to stay focused on that. How can we make sure that companies can actually cater to the long term?
When we take into account, for instance, the great acceleration graphs, who show us that when it concerns to emissions, CO2 emissions, to the use of paper, the use of water, the use or international tourism, it really goes up in an exponential way. Besides agreements on Kyoto, the Paris Agreement. So there is a big problem with our dominant political and economic structures. So indeed, we have to be very critical about what is going on. And the SDGs, for instance, I'm in favor. That's a kind of government story, but I think it's a really soft approach to tackle those urgent issues. So yeah, I agree that it often goes hand in hand. And when we see on the UN level, for instance, United Nations level, that they plea for a green economy. And in a way, it is important that we also try to create win-win situations for companies in the economic part, and the ecological part, and then maybe also try to improve our welfare. But in a way, what we see at the moment is what I already said about those great acceleration graphs, that we are really expanding our planetary boundaries, and that the inequality is growing as well. So there is really a big problem with the dominant political and economic structures and strategies at this moment.
Yeah, Sibu is not entirely wrong. Let me explain it, not entirely. We do know from academic research that there sometimes are connections and sometimes conflicts of interests between politicians and lobbyists and companies and so on. So that does happen. That's not a myth. And we do see the consequences, and sometimes we can reveal the consequences of that through good academic research. Where I'm a little bit more skeptical about Sibu is her optimism about what the governments can do. Because we often think that people say, why don't governments just make it mandatory that companies are sustainable? Just may put it in law and get it over and done with. But that's a lot easier said than done. And that's often because, well, you have to rely on measurements. What is sustainable? How do you measure this? And we actually know from a lot of academic research that therefore well-intended government interventions and policies and regulations and law can very often have unintended consequences, and sometimes, well, harmful unintended consequences that can actually make the problem worse rather than better. Just to give you one brief example from my own research, I've done quite a lot of research on the IVF industry together with a colleague, Mihaela Stan from University College London. So in vitro fertilization. And at the time that this industry came about, the UK government wanted to do something good and said, we want to create transparency in the market for patients. Therefore, we're going to make it mandatory that clinics have to publish their success rate, a simple number of pregnancies that result from the treatment. What the government didn't realize is that, well, if you want to get someone pregnant, some patients are a lot more difficult to get pregnant than others. And what some clinics started to do is therefore sort of manipulate the input. They started rejecting people with difficult underlying medical conditions. Of course, that was not the intention of the government. But if you measure something and you put regulation to it, yeah, then often you get sort of these type of unintended consequences. So where I'm a little bit more skeptical is what governments really can do in terms of regulation. That is often very difficult. The last thing that I will say about this, I do think it's important that government do something, and actually the EU there is important. Because if you ask what is difficult for companies, no, one is uncertainty, changing regulations, but it's very much also, if it's not a level playing field, competition. If laws and regulations are different in different countries, and if companies can go shop around in different countries where the regulation is most favorable or most profitable and so on. So what is important for companies, that in all its imperfections of regulation, that at least it's the same everywhere across all competitions. And there, the fact that we have an EU rather than a whole bunch of individual countries with all their own regulation, that is an important thing.